A few miles north of the Stilson Ranch house lay the furrows of the original Santa Fe Trail, made famous by the Pony Express Company, delivering mail across the nation in the 19th century. Joe sometimes took his two kids to the foundations of an old Pony Express relay station on the trail. There they found little artifacts of a bygone era. Many times they found flint arrowheads. These arrowheads were left strewn all around the station's foundation. Hundreds of the chipped flint projectile points mixed in with the multicolored pebbles across a sandstone tableland. One Sunday, Joe took his sons in the old sky blue pickup to the remains of the relay station, now a part of the Stilson's pasture land. Joe also took his ancient Bakelite plastic camera. He had Steve and Clyde pose in mountain climbing poses on the sides of short arroyo cliffs and among the ruins. Being at such a high elevation, 6,100 feet, a thunderhead that gathers and forms a large storm cloud high in the sky on the coast looks entirely more foreboding on the high plains, because most of the thunderclouds are a mere 2,000 feet above the prairie. The lightning strikes with a nearby wallop, and thunder cracks in rolling shudders. While they were exploring the ruins, just such a thunderstorm gathered and began blasting lightning around the three. They ran and jumped in the pickup and huddled together, while pounding sheets of rain fell hard. These rainstorms are so fierce that a person cannot see more than a dozen yards through the deluge. On a typical summer night, Steve and Clyde got permission to take the old blue pickup out into the middle of a wheat field about 10 miles to the east. There was neither a cloud nor moon in the sky. They saw there no artificial light to be seen at all in any direction to the horizon. After an hour or so, the boys' eyes adjusted to the starlight, to the point that they could clearly see the Milky Way, glowing brightly and intensely. While they star-watched, Steve thought about how special the high plains were. Being so isolated did not keep the Gannys from very rarely buying things. They simply sent a check in the mail with a hand-entered order slip from a printed catalog, usually Sears and Roebuck and sometimes Monkey Ward's. Some weeks later, something approaching the order they had made would arrive by parcel post at the mailbox out on the county road 2 miles from the ranch house. When city folk arrive on the high plains, they always feel the need to hurry away. The wide openness, coupled with the high altitude, seemed to drive them into a type of anxious panic to be away from there. In the early 20th century, many very large dinosaur fossils were found in several areas of Colorado. The depth required to dig probably has kept these finds sparse over the centuries. The depth to reach the water table on the high plains has thwarted many a homesteader in the region. Chapter 15. Homeless in Montana. The light blue pickup glowed against the twists of dark forest as they pulled into the tiny border town in northern Montana. Joe's nerves were shredded by 26 hours of driving. It was about 5 in the morning. They decided to have breakfast at the only greasy spoon they could find. It was open, and so they went in and sat down at a booth. There did not seem to be anybody there. Rosie said, "Well, that's that. Let's go. Something's wrong here." As they started to rise, a woman arrived at the booth.
"Sorry, folks. We're supposed to be open, but Earl isn't here yet. He overslept again, I expect. I'm just the waitress, not the cook, too."
"We can't order any food?" complained the tired Rosie as she glared at the table. The waitress looked flustered. She chewed on her nails a little. Finally her head came up and she put her hands on her hips.
"But that's just life, I guess. I could make you all pancakes. I'm not really much of a cook, but hey, I can do pancakes," she offered.
Joe smiled and then replied, "Yes, that would be wonderful. We'll all have pancakes." The waitress beamed a smile that slid into a grimace as she waved her hand and walked into the kitchen. Joe looked at Rosie steadily. Joe asked Rosie, "Do you think they're going to let us even back into Canada? Remember, Carly wrote Ruth and Benny that all the new homesteading in Canada is stopped." Rosie wagged her head back and forth and stared at the ceiling. She sighed and looked across the table at her husband. "I have no idea, but we have to try. We have to know that we tried, if nothing else," she replied tiredly. After another half hour, the waitress cum cook arrived with their pancakes. They were not edible. The smug border officer crossed his arms and recited, as if from memory, "Mr. Gandy, I'm sorry, but you qualify only as an undesirable, according to our categorization process. The great northern state of Canada does not want you as a citizen." Joe growled, "I'm a U.S. Navy veteran. I'm as a hard-working person as anyone in my family." The border guard scowled and ground out, "You are over 45 years old. You don't have at least $30,000 in the bank. You never finished high school, and you have no valuable skill. You're a cowboy. We already have way too many of those. And you probably own a lot of guns. I have filed a report on you, so all the other border entry points have your information. Now I would advise you to leave. You will never be allowed to become a Canadian citizen." The officious little border weasel left the room. Joe's head was bowed. He looked crushed. They spent the day driving away from the border in silence. They wandered generally south, all the way to Dillon, Montana. When it was clear that they did not still retain enough savings to afford gas all the way back to southeastern Colorado, they started searching for a temporary cowhand job for Joe. After trying for a week, Joe could not find work as a cowboy, but plenty of readily available irrigation pipe moving jobs. Joe took the first full-time opening and moved the family into a single-wide trailer, situated in the middle of a giant circular irrigated alfalfa field some 15 miles south of Dillon. Steve woke up each morning, stretched out of bed, walked through his back door and pissed off the steps onto the bare ground where they parked tractors and hay balers. Although they had electricity, there was no running water, just a cattle tank fed by electric pump behind the trailer in the field. The outhouse sat 100 feet to the left of the trailer. Thinly attached to the back of the trailer was the makeshift room Steve used as a bedroom. It really had been a tack and feed shed up to the point Steve moved inside, and he had locked the gate leading from the corrals. Always the thick, sweet smell of alfalfa wafted through from all around them. The local high school metal shop instructor and his son built high-speed hay-baling hauler monstrosities. They looked more like monster cars attempting to join Skeletor's crew of road warriors. Typically black with red and white artistic highlights, these were Cadillac Eldorados with their skins ripped off, cabin and engine compartments caged in 2-inch steel bars, high-performance superchargers, huge forks with giant hydraulic cylinders, and swivel balls on small, fast steering wheels. Steve stood watching, transfixed by them. When they came to call, usually in threes, the rancher or farmer paid them each $100, and in less than a day, all 1,000 acres of hay bales were collected and stacked into long haystacks. They looked like madmen, driving hand-welded, Terminator-style bale-collecting machines across the fields, picking up huge cubes of bales, racing to the main stack to deposit them, and then driving back into the field again with an empty fork. This was like a homemade Hells on Wheels harvest tour. Joe was gone, horseback for a week, moving cows and calves in a massive cattle drive with the ranch owner and all the other hired hands over 125 miles to a new owner who had bought the whole herd. There was an actual horse-drawn chuck wagon trailing behind. It was driven by a large old man with a grizzled beard. He proved an expert cook, serving 3 hearty meals each day. Joe enjoyed every minute of the journey. Meanwhile, Steve had organized Clyde and himself to pack up and hike out of the ranch for a camping adventure. Steve mentioned to his mother that he and Clyde would be camping for a week, and not to worry, they would be fine. Rosie became upset, but when she saw how serious Steve was, although flustered, began to gather items for Steve to take with him. Steve suffered through her usual overprotectiveness and grouchily took most of it with him. That is, until he and Clyde passed towards an old unused outbuilding that Steve had discovered. He led Clyde inside the old hen hutch and selected about 20 pounds of the many extra things their mother insisted they take and deposited them on the floor. With lighter loads, the two started trekking east towards the eastern mountain ridge of the Ruby Valley. When they came to a fairly wide rushing river, Steve announced that it was a good place to look for a campsite. There was no interest or intention to cross so much water. The site they found was only 30 yards from the water. It had some tree cover, loamy grass, and flat place for the three-man tent they had lugged with them. Steve proceeded to set up the tent and instructed Clyde to search for firewood. They had been happily camping for about 5 days when Joe rode up on horseback and found their camp. "Your mama's worried sick about you boys. How in the hell are you doing out here anyway?" Joe asked. Steve walked up to his old daddy, still sitting in the saddle. He replied to Joe, "We're just fine. We're having ourselves a time. Tell Mama we'll be home in a few days, and try to get her to stop worrying. I know what I'm doing." "What have you had to eat?" Joe asked Steve. Steve grinned a big, proud smile as Clyde piped up. "Steve's been making us trout for lunch and supper and pancakes for breakfast. They're real good. We had hen eggs the first few days. Now it's just the pancakes and fish." After 2 years in Montana, like clockwork, Rosie began working on the family to prepare them to move to another faraway place. Joe dug in and would not even talk to Rosie about it. However, he was eventually moved by the harsh Montana winters, especially the second year there, when it got down to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit a few times. He finally, reluctantly, agreed to try finding a way to homestead in Canada. They packed up the old Ford pickup and drove west and north to the Canadian border. When the border guard asked why they wanted to cross into Canada, Joe lied and claimed that they were just visiting friends in Williams Lake. The guard let them through. They did return to Williams Lake and spent 3 months attempting to get a long-term visa and tried to file for a homestead permit. The end result was a strongly worded letter threatening to arrest and deport the Gandys if they did not leave Canada by their own volition within 2 weeks. Dejectedly, Joe and Rosie repacked the pickup and angrily headed south. Chapter 16. Homeless in Oroville. The old sky blue 1957 Ford pickup truck strained under the full load of the small family and all their possessions inside the olive drab cube that filled the truck bed. After crossing the Canadian border into the U.S., they pulled slowly into the little town of Oroville, Washington. It was the first town south of the border, a border town with a fairly unfriendly disposition by the looks of it. Everyone was quiet. Joe looked off down the road and frowned. Rosie finally broke the silence as they slid through the one traffic light in the small town. It was only a single flashing yellow light, perhaps meant to annoy people rushing through enough to hopefully gain some much-needed business for the few stores there. "You know, we only have about $200 left. Is that enough for us to get back to Colorado?" she inquired of Joe. Joe often quipped, "I can almost live just off all the good stuff people stupidly throw away." Joe did not answer for a long while. Then he mumbled, "Well, we'll never make it all the way back to Villagreen. Even if we did, we'd have nothing to live on there, while I search for a job, even if I can find one." Rosie measured her words carefully. She slowly and quietly said, "Well, we better stop in this little town and get some kind of plan going. I know we never planned on getting kicked out of Canada, but we're in this mess now, so we might as well make the best of it." The Gandys ended up holed up in a tiny hotel room at the Alaska Highway View Hotel at the south end of town. The only work Joe could find was the most miserable work available in the apple orchards. Steve followed his family into the empty apple orchard. The onset of winter had stripped the last leaves, leaving the branches bare. Nothing of value seemed apparent. But then Joe bent down under a large bough and picked up a little hard yellow rock. At least it seemed like a rock to Steve. When he looked closer, he saw it was actually a half-rotten apple that had fallen to the ground when it was still green. "This is what we want, Steve. You and Clyde help your mama and me. We have to fill these apple picker bags and then dump them in those plywood bins you see down the row," his dad explained. Steve's face fell. He could not believe it had come to this. How such a thing could happen, he could not understand. His old daddy tied the straps of a square-hooped picker's bag over his shoulders and around his waist. Steve remembered these days in a poem years later.